Praxis is an NGO that undertakes community development and participatory research with people experiencing poverty and societal marginalisation. And it has a truly international reputation for its very innovative and empowering work in enabling people to work for social change in very challenging circumstances, particularly work on bonded labour, trafficking, sex work, and with all communities facing stigmatisation. And Pradeep works tirelessly on these topics and has played a leading role, I think, in developing the work of Praxis in this area. So we were delighted to welcome him to a research fellowship at Durham. He got an award from the Global Challenges Research Fund and was due to have been in Durham in the earlier part of this year, but of course could only be here virtually. So the work on the community-led ethical review processes was part of Pradeep's fellowship, but unfortunately he had to undertake it all in India rather than spending part of the time in Durham. So Pradeep, I would now like to hand over to you to give your talk, and I'm going to share the screen and move the slides on. Is that successful?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. And I think depending on which continent, which place you are there. And I'm from Praxis Institute for Participatory Practices. And this is a program, as Sarah said, it is primarily for us, for me to develop the work which we are doing into a kind of a research. And before I begin it, I thank Sarah as well as Andrew for supporting this entire effort. And I would like to say that for participatory practitioners, mere extraction of information from communities is unethical, even if it is done in a participatory way. So participatory research thus has its own ethics. So in a participatory research program, a researcher cannot blame the research design for not deliberating on information, issue, or theme emanating from the participants. So participatory approaches often oscillate between being a science, adhering strictly to design, and being art, exercising creative discretion based on information and analysis from participants and the context. In this context, what has happened is, over the period, that ethics has become significant and assumes itself to be neutral for the cause of curbing the potentially unbridled freedom of the artist and the conceivably insensitive application of techniques of science. So organizations have also have created institutional review boards, and they are often projected as independent bodies, and they have become the de facto guardian of the ethics. Next slide. Now, over the time, it was not difficult to realize that research, however participatory it is at the time of data collection, but when it is organized under the control of the North, it cannot be termed participatory. So 3 ways through which the North controls the knowledge is through aid, which is funding, then certification, which is a control over publishing, and the last one is the ethics. Interestingly, while aid and certification is headquartered in the North, the ethical review system is not. However, it may not be untrue that the Institutional Review Board would define the ethics, keeping in mind the concerns of the donors as well as the publishers. Now, when we say North, it is not a geographical category, but a political category. It is a metaphor that represents Brahmin. There is a capitalist, able-bodied, heterosexual, masculine Brahmin in most terrain. Would it be a wrong assumption that this category, although minuscule, could control funds, knowledge, and ethics in those terrains? Next slide. Now, a lot of struggle for equity in research has always focused on the aid industry, less on the publishing industry, and the least on ethics. Keeping this domination in mind, Praxis embarked into the institutionalizing community-led ethical review processes. It has been organizing the same for the last 6 years, primarily to understand community perspective ethics and thus inform its own projects. So we had in the first stage 3 community review groups, and then standing community committees, and then the capacity building program. We are at this point of time in the reflection stage of the stage 3. Next slide. Praxis organized 3 ethical review processes, one comprising communities considered vulnerable to HIV, that is sex workers, MSM, transgender, IDUs, injecting drug users, and a second one comprising bonded labor, and a third one comprising child laborers. So there has been significant learning for us from these processes as well as a reflection of their functioning. I'll go through 2 of them, which were critical reflections here. The first one is, do these community committees give any information newer than the institutional review boards? This is the primary question which is asked to us. I would say no. In fact, an honest, comprehensive research proposal generally lists a lot of ethical risks, and these are based on cumulative knowledge of various researchers. So it is not that the community boards discover any new issues, but the discussion in the review meetings were based on examples that were real and lived by the members. And so were the understanding of risk for them. So when they explore solutions to address those risks, they are more real, but yet are varied and sometimes very instinctive as well. Next slide. Now, the second question which is asked is, have they ever contested what the IRB recommends? I would say yes, in many ways. The first thing is the community committees seem to be more inclined to study difficult aspects related to the community. They are not necessarily averse to taking risk when compared to IRBs, especially when they are related to systemic constraints. If I give an example, owing to stringent legislation in India that makes it mandatory to report any child sex abuse cases to legal authorities in India if you find during the research, IRBs often worry about sanctioning research reaching out to potential victims for the fear of probable violation of laws. And the community committees, however, encourage researchers to organize such studies more and more and reach out to difficult to reach groups. And in fact, it says that the restraining is considered as unethical if you don't. Then the second and interesting thing is on the compensation. Often the quantitative surveys, respondents are paid some monetary compensation. So the community committees often ask what the compensation is for. Is it for the time spent by the respondent, or is it for the information which they have given? How honorarium rates are fixed? Are they at par with researchers? And how the compensation to respondents often affect the other studies when done by the communities themselves or grassroots organizations who cannot pay compensation. Is it not true that by compensating for the respondent time, the researcher gets priceless information for free? So the fear is that often the compensation is compensate for the guilt that is present in researchers owing to unfair profit that they earn in the form of funds or the profit, career growth, or fame from the publications. Many of these are non-monetizable. The last one is the consent letter. I would say, after a reflection, which I would say the institution of consent letter is the biggest scam of the research industry. The consent letter was meant to be an instrument of acknowledgement of having conveyed all risks and potential harm that respondents might face if they become part of the process. However, what it has become, it has emerged into a consent system through which actually the researchers absolve themselves of any responsibility if the respondent faces any future harm. The community ethics group, while recognizing and understanding this, have often wanted the research teams to explore whether researchers could provide a consent letter to the respondents and how researchers would about how the researchers would use or not use this information. Is it not surprising that the consent letter, which is meant to protect community, is all the time pocketed by the researchers, and there is no copy with the respondent? How will communities make researchers accountable for breaking the promises in the consent letter when they do not even have a copy of the consent letter? Is it not that the IRB's proceedings are primarily to protect the institution from getting any bad name if the communities are not protected during the research? So the real question for any ethical review board or institutional review board is whom they are meant to protect. Is it the community? Is it the research? Or is it the organization? Do these necessarily align? And when they contest, how do ethics get defined? Are there any ethics of defining ethics? Next slide. With these questions, since March 2020, Praxis embarked into the formation of the standing committee-led ethical review boards to review any kind of research proposal, participatory or non-participatory. While pursuing that, the following 3 additional considerations were made, which we did not do in the earlier ethical review boards. The first one is, generally we have a day-long training of community board on ethics, but this time we have almost like a 4-month intensive capacity building program for each members. Secondly, we also focused on the knowledge on community identity politics. We attempted to provide space for communities to understand the stigmatization associated with the communities that they may not belong to as well. This became relevant because of the way intersecting identities such as caste in India and gender operates. Now, the third one is there was also focus on how programs and research functions, for it was felt important that members, community members are able to connect appropriately the ethics with practices followed in research and program. The 3 community review boards are being established are also, we are ensuring that it is not just a one-off capacity building thing, because these are as of now, these are not like a research. These are a continuous, I would say, a program. So there will be 3 community ethical review board, each of 4 members, one belonging to a denotified and nomadic community here, who are from the formerly criminal tribes, so-called criminal tribes in India, who are also engaging in sex work. Second one is the transgender community who have been engaging with HIV projects. And the third one is, again, among India, there is a caste system in which there is the Dalit community who are at the so-called bottom of the caste system. And they are part of the project as beneficiaries or agent of change. So they become the one independent ethical review board. Now, each of them will form a project advisory board in India, and they will cater to their own constituency. But that was the beginning. But later we thought that we could also try to find out how they can together operate and build some solidarity together. We formed this group, and then the COVID happened. So therefore, some of the how we brought the selection was made from by Praxis, with whom they have engaged already, a mix of peer volunteers, researchers, and community members. Owing to the pandemic situation, one consideration was added that is they need to have access to smartphones. However, when we found out they are not able to access it, so we were able to provide honorarium, smartphones, and data cost to some of the participants based on their notes, with the support from the fellowship grant from the Durham University. Next slide. We organized an intensive capacity development program, which was largely discussion based around a number of case studies, and we got fellowship support also. And these were all based on certain case study approaches. So there was tremendous learning from various processes. But I would like to give an example of one particular case study, one of the many 4 case studies which we used. So just giving an example of case study here, giving a more detail. So there is a village with 90 garment workers residing in 3 caste homogeneous hamlets. So caste system categorizes people into hierarchy. There also results what is called as untouchability. In India, untouchability is banned, but not the caste system. So Hamlet A is a dominant caste hamlet having 80 families with 27 garment workers, whereas Hamlet B comprised of what is called as middle caste, and Hamlet C comprised of what is called as Dalit caste. So it had 100 families and 35 garment workers, and Dalit Hamlet had 95 families and 18 garment workers. And this program, the project which was operating, it says taken from a project program which is already there. It is not a case study of this particular study or a program, but an independent program, which is where there is a need to open a tuition center to build trust with the community and also to reach out to the garment workers. Now, the challenge for the program was in which hamlet should the center be started. So with the rationale that the Hamlet B has the largest number of garment workers and families, the community support group, again, it was decided in a consensus way by the community themselves, said that let us start the center in the Hamlet B. The center was functional and the program was running very successfully. But Hamlet C is a Dalit Hamlet. And what happens is, the children from the hamlet or anybody from the hamlet, when they enter into any other hamlets, they have to remove their slippers. This is applicable only for the Dalit children, Dalit people to get into the other hamlets. and the tuition center is in B. So the Dalit children are undoubtedly subjected to this practice of discrimination, although it appears to have been normalized in the village. Now, what we did was we presented this case study to all the three different community ethical groups and asked them what is their opinion about where the hamlet should be, how you should be able to govern the ethics of starting this center, and what will be your consideration. Next slide. If you see that what we found out, different people had different opinions. So some of them are conservative, who say that project should work within the accepted cultural setting of the community. So Hamlet B is fine. And some are rational, who say that project objectives are being fulfilled. So Hamlet B is fine, the middle Hamlet. Whereas some are moderate people who said that the decision promotes casteism, but for achieving project objects, Hamlet B be the starting point. And over the period, why not you sensitize the community? That is the third category. Then the fourth categories are, the liberal category. They said this decision promotes casteism. So project needs to have one more center in Hamlet C. Have one in Hamlet B and have another in Hamlet C. That's the liberal point of view. Then there is a radical point of view, which said that the projects needs to confront casteism. So start in Hamlet C only. At the end, it is unethical for a project to not confront casteism when it realizes the presence of the same. That's the radical people. Then the sixth is the participation people, who said that the project needs to go by the community's decision. So Hamlet B was taken by the decision was taken by the community. So why not you go with that community's decision? Why are you imposing your own ideology on the community? And the seventh category is the transformative participation people, who said that the project needs to confront and re-engage with the community. In this case, it is important to understand that the community in the first instance will often throw a decision that is in consonance with patriarchy or the caste system. And one day if confronted, they would be able to change its stance, for many silent voices will emerge in the discussion. So these are, if you see, these are in a single case study, actually you get different points of view from among the 12 to 13 members who were present. So similar to this, you had a number of other case studies were thoroughly discussed, and when members went beyond their political correctness, various such nuances emerged. So the crucial challenge that was seen in the discussion was to how to arrive at a consensual decision. In the first round, there was a lot of disagreement, and when we revisited the same case study again after a couple of months, many changed their opinion, and more members were among the later categories of 5, 6, 7, but still not a singular opinion. Next slide. So the challenge for us is, what is a reflection when we saw this, some preliminary inferences which I want to make at this point of time, is that firstly, a number of decisions are often taken at the research and program level, which appear very rational from the lens of the research objectives. But there is a possibility of intrinsic presence of patriarchy or casteism in that. Unless one proactively dissects a decision from that lens, it may not be visible, especially in the scenario of socially conditioned existence. In this context, the question is, what is ethical? Is it ignoring these intrinsic factors or proactively looking for these factors? In the case of the later, if you want to live proactively, one is asked whether is it ethical one imposes a particular lens on a decision that appears to be comfortably embedded in a program. The second thing is that there are multiple opinions within a group, and each of these in an institutional ethical review group, each of these bounds from a particular ideological viewpoint. Like in the above case studies, there are 3 dimensions. One is whether the decision promotes caste system or not. The second is whether the decision is an imposition on the community or not. And the third one is whether the decision is going to affect the project outcomes negatively, thereby harming the current existing beneficiaries or not. So in that, all the 3 dimensions often intersect, and there would be many contradictions. The challenge here is that the decisions would align with a particular ideology, and contradictions are about conflicting ideologies often. So the key question is whether these conflicting ideologies play any role in defining the ethics that would govern our decision making. And if it is yes, is that right? Is the question. So that's the real challenge in arriving at a decision. So it may not be wrong to assume that even an institutional review board would have required to confront this kind of situation. And one wonders how they would arrive at a decision based on consensus. What would have mattered to them? The high volume of the chairperson, or the ideology of the organization that the committee is of, or the considerations of the funders. For example, in this case, for the organization, that is Praxis, the dimension of social equity is important. Hence, at no point of time would Praxis like any of its practices to support caste-based discrimination. So does this mean the organization's ideology would be the governing ideology of an ethical review group to base its recommendation on? If yes, is this process ethical? What if for the organization that are patriarchal or those ignore patriarchy or caste system? In that case, the institutional review process would avoid addressing issues related to patriarchy. And if organizational ethics is the basis, then isn't the entire mechanism of institutional review process a sham? Hasn't the review process then become the basis to introduce organizational ideology and even the ideology of donors from the back door? These are some of the questions which we think we need, which we thought we need to be, which are to be studied in depth. Often we end up trying to reform the institutional review mechanism, but the real challenge is in unearthing the purpose, why it exists in the first place. Whose interest does it serve? Whose reality counts for them? The next slide. I think, sorry, yeah, next slide. Yeah. So a quote from Marx here will be self-explanatory, where he says that a philosopher produces ideas, a poet poems, a clergyman sermons, a criminal produces crimes, and the criminal produces not only crimes but also criminal law, and also the professor who gives lecture on criminal law. And in addition to this, an inevitable compendium in which the same professor throws his lectures into the general market as commodities. And the criminal end up producing even the whole of police and of criminal justice, constables, judges, hangman, juries, etc. So just imagine a light-hearted comment. If it were true that the ideology that governs the development aid industry, after having secured the publishing industry, thought that it has seized the research agenda as well as a certification agenda, but has no control over the academic freedom enjoyed by the academics. So it needs an institution created by academics to control themselves, for otherwise they will scream about their freedom being taken away. So the solution of creation of an institutional review board emerged. And then they thought about how to ensure that they do not have an independent ideology. So they just started calling it an ethical review committee. So if that is true, there is a need to decommoditize ethics. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Pradeep. That was challenging and provocative, and I think there's so much that we can talk about. So if people would like to raise, they can clap, you can put your mic on and give a round of applause, or you can do the applause through reaction. So I'm going to give some physical clapping. And thank you very, very much indeed. I'm now going to pass over to Andrew Russell. We are recording, so anybody who doesn't want to have their face showing on the recording, we'll record the discussion. Please, you feel free to turn your camera off, but otherwise you can leave it on. Andrew Russell will chair the next session, which is about questions and comments. And just so you know, in the meantime, I'm going to be preparing breakout groups, so we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes of comments and questions, so we'll keep them quite brief, and then you'll have the opportunity to go into smaller groups to discuss some questions, then coming back from the small groups at 12:10 and obviously closing at 12:30. So in the gap between the main session and the breakout groups, if anybody needs a 2-minute break, feel free to do that then. That'll be in about 15 minutes time. So over to you now, Andrew.
Thanks, Sarah. Hello, everybody. I just wondered whether, I think it's easier, there's too many people for you to put your hands up in the in your individual sort of little boxes on Zoom. So I would suggest if you'd like to ask a question, just pop a yes or no, a yes into the chat, and we can contact you that way, ask you to speak that way, or indeed just put a question in the chat and then I can take the question forward for Pradeep, or Pradeep can answer it directly. So please just get started. I've got a question for Pradeep, which is of a more sort of technical one, really. I thought the slide was fascinating, Pradeep, where you had the various things. I got a sense of development during the project that you outlined between people starting off with a sense of their own sort of identity and place in society, and then sort of moving on to position that in terms of, you know, wider social constructs and structural violence and things like that. And I just wondered if you wanted to comment a little bit more. Was I right to get that picture from your talk?
Yeah. So the point which we thought was that earlier the communities, like as a community of sex workers, so ethical review board of sex workers will generally study about the research proposals which are on the sex work community. So this time what we did was we tried to help capacity development of the community ethical review board, not only on the challenges with the sex work community face, which they all know, but also about what the Dalits face or what the transgender community face. So in that way, the aim here was to develop a solidarity among all the marginalized communities so that they are able to understand each other's marginalization, and thereby also understanding the intersectionalities around the issues of gender, caste and class and the sexuality, etc. So to that extent, I thought it was a interesting thing even for us to see that how they are, whether they are sensitive about other marginalization things which are happening, etc. I don't know, did I answer the question?
Yeah, thanks very much.
Thanks.
I mean, I could follow on because there was another point on the slide where you were talking about the difference between a one-day training and a 4-month kind of sort of intensive kind of capacity building project. And I just wondered, how do you feel that, I mean, how long should these projects last for? Do you think 4 months was enough, or?
Right. See, the difference between 1 day and 4 months look quite different, primarily because of the COVID reasons here. Because the 4 month here does not mean that we had like 4 months of thing. It was like 1 hour almost every week. So it would be around 8 to 10 hours, which is the thing. But what happens is between the hours, between the sessions, they get a lot of things to work on, and then they come and present. So in that sense, while the time they spent on with us probably may not be maybe only to double the time, but what it is more than that is what are they have enough of time to digest and to look at the learning which they had it during the session with the realities which they are facing. And when they come with a reflection on that. So this entire exercise was I would say a big bonus, which happened only because of the COVID thing. Yeah.
Thank you. So does anybody else have questions for Pradeep? Please either speak up or put them in the chat, or just indicate you'd like to ask a question in the chat. Everybody's being very shy.
Can I come in then in that case? So Pradeep, you're obviously highly critical of academic institutions, not necessarily individual academics, of course. Do you think there are any benefits at all of the institutional review boards? And are there any lessons that the community review boards can learn from some of the ways in which those, obviously you are learning that you're wanting to do things differently, but is there any value at all? Or do you feel that they ought to be completely scrapped, or do they need to just rethink and perhaps undergo some training with praxis in order to rethink what are their ethics, how do they make decisions, and in whose interests are they working?
Right. I think the purpose of this was definitely not to criticize the existence of the Institutional Review Board, but primarily whenever we are establishing an IRB mechanism, are we conscious of the fact that it is a powerful body which is in the name of ethics is going to influence a lot of decisions, and often it operates in two ways. One, it says that it actually gives out a recommendation which is against the researcher's decision, is first. But more than that, how the power operates is many of us write our proposals keeping already IRB in mind. So we already start compromising on many of our research questions, thinking that IRBs are not going to approve that. So it actually sits in the heads of the researchers while developing the proposal itself. So for us, when we were engaging with the various studies, we were continuously confronted with many of the donors think first, and then IRB, like many of the donors started using the IRB's shoulders to say that this will not pass through our IRB thing, so don't ask these questions, etc. So in that sense, there is we felt that there is a lot of power which was making us very uncomfortable. So that is the reason why we started engaging with this IRB system, so that we come up with a parallel thing. But when we did the parallel exercise, we followed a lot of IRB things, right? So in that sense, we value many of the IRB process, especially the importance of an oversight thing, importance of a independent body which looks at very critically on the operation, on the relationship between the respondent and the researcher, and also look at it from the dimension of do no harm principle. So all these things are something which we totally appreciate that should have been done through various systems, but just we wanted to say that it has its own negative implication. Let us be conscious about it.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Pradeep. Anne has a question about whether do you have some practical ways in which you feel university ethics boards can adapt or change their procedures, or is that something that you're going to make the subject of your future research?
Yeah, it is not something which we can say at this point of time. What we thought was we can document a lot of processes which are happening now with the community ethical review board, and some of the things which I'm sure are the questions which they have to be very transparent about how ethics are defined by them and where they are getting those ethics from. So one of the important thing is about transparency. And the second thing which I feel is important is that while the secrecy is important on how certain decisions are made within the institutional review board, but at the same time, what is important is also to say that what are the different alternatives which were considered and how they were dismissed, and what was the way by which it was dismissed, is something which an IRB should come out. And the third one is, of course, the representation issue, who these IRB members are. When we say they are they independent of only that institute, or are they also independent of the worldview which they represent, which the entire institute represents? So how independence itself is defined. These are some of the three, four things which I thought could be something which could be a learning for an IRB thing. Probably I would say there has not been much of critical reading of IRB itself. So there is a reading. I think some of these are very natural to come out.
Thank you. And Kat in Australia, I believe, is asking whether you have a vision for an ideal process of knowledge production.
Right. Knowledge production is too large a term at this point of time. which goes much beyond the IRB mechanism itself. As we said that as of now, we believe quite a lot that that a knowledge system has been under an unfair or unjust control, because you can see that most of the peer-reviewed publications, a lot of publishing in terms of knowledge, etc., are emanating from a particular part of the geography, which is also a political category. So even if the research happens in the south, once they get published in the north, a lot of importance of the power which is otherwise in the south gets lost. So in that sense, I would say we should assume that the knowledge production at this point of time is not a just one. Now the question is, what is our vision? Our vision is very simple, that as much as possible, there is a space by which we can bring the voices in the margin into the mainstream, and also deconstruct what is called as gray literature, and which is developed through a gray mechanism. And how we are able to mainstream that gray mechanism is something which will be a bigger challenge. It might be very rhetorical and philosophical, but if one goes into the operation part of it, one can easily understand different ways by which we can actually mainstream a lot of knowledge which are produced in the south of the south as well. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. We've got 4 more questions, which are all really great. And I think that will bring our question and answer session to an end. So Neve, I wondered if you'd like to ask your question, please.
Thanks. I'm just trying to find out where I wrote it, because I've just written 2. Okay, I was interested in whether that was just fascinating. And I was interested in whether you had different experiences with different ethical review boards in different countries, I guess, because I guess IRB is a kind of a US-centric term. And things are a little bit different in the UK, which is certainly not to say better. But I suppose I'm partly asking because for the last 3 years, I've been director of ethics for a very large faculty at a university in the UK. And when I took on that role, I was surprised by actually how little ethical review process there was, and how much I had to invent and kind of put in place for better or worse. So I would just be interested if you've got something to say about different places, different countries or regions.
Yeah, see, we have probably only an experience of last 6 months to have to started reviews at so therefore, and what we have found is that we are not able to locate anywhere that people are able to explain a lot about how ethics are evolved within an IRB. Is it something given to them, or is it something left to the members, or is it something a set of principles are evolved, etc., is something which we are struggling with. One area where we can learn a lot is on the medical part of it. A lot of effort has gone into once the ethics is related to the medical part of it. So therefore, there is a possibility, especially the HIV academics, at that time, a lot of, investment has gone into that part. But unfortunately, even the medical ethics is largely governed by the territoriality of different nations to have control over whatever is the outcome of the studies in that. So it also gets into the regime of the, the nationalist regime of how there should be a future control about whatever coming out of the research. So which is another set of problem which we thought we should confront with. So therefore, I would rather like to learn more from you at some point of time to help us understand what are the various kind of scenarios which are developing on that. I would totally say that I don't have that much of information or knowledge on different ethical. I know more about our own ethical review board, which is also struggling in terms of not being able to come out. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. There's a couple of, I think, really interesting comments as well as questions in the chat. which I'll just go through because I think they could also inform the discussions that we have in the breakout rooms. So we have Andy Dearden pointing out or questioning whether local or community review boards have a role in monitoring ongoing research, and pointing out that institutional review boards in the North are very far removed from the day-to-day practice of the actual research. And then Sophie is pointing out that it's almost like we need to review the key concepts that underpin our ethical understandings routinely used. And these concepts have evolved from a very academic perspective, and she completely sees the need to move towards a more co-productive model. And it's a big challenge, she says, for us in the UK, as our ethics are so closely controlled, particularly by the Health Research Authority. But the focus on co-production in health research and the need to involve communities in developing ethics applications might be helpful in taking us forward. So with those thoughts in mind, I'd like to direct you all to the very bottom of the chat, where Sarah has put up 3 questions that she'd like the breakout groups to discuss. And they are what you think are the strengths of the concept of community-led ethical review developed by Praxis in India. What do you think might be some of the limitations or challenges of putting these into practice? And how would it work in your own country or your own context? Do you have similar examples from your own country or context? So the plan is we'll have breakout groups to discuss these, and indeed any other questions that come up in the course of your discussions for about half an hour, and then we'll all join again at
10 past 12.
10 past 12.
20 minutes.
20 minutes, so I said half an hour, 20 minutes. Yeah. So a limited time for discussion, but I hope that you'll get a lot out of it.
Good to see. I hope you had some interesting discussions in there. So we've just got about 20 minutes now to take very brief feedback from each room and then draw to some conclusions about this topic. So breakout group 1, what I'd like you to do is what we call a lightning presentation. That is a really quick, snappy one. Maybe just one key point from each of the 3 questions about the strengths, the limitations, and would it work in your context. So group 1, I know Andrew was in that group. I don't know whether you are the one who was facilitating, Andrew, or someone else will be willing to feedback for group 1.
I can try and do a very quick run. So we had a discussion about who's involved in doing the review. Is it the people who are directly involved in doing the research, or is it some form of sort of independent people from the wider community, and was that important? We had discussions around, is it strength that the community, strange that they're not really by default. So I think this highlights a gap in the normal ethics review processes. But there were a lot of discussions around time and payment, and whether or not people's contributions were recognised, and whether or not institutions would support that in different contexts. The feeling often being that there might be some potential limitations there. That'll do, I think, for a very quick run of a much bigger discussion.
All right, thank you very much, Andrew. Room 2, I know that had Pradeep in it and several other people. Would somebody like to give a brief report back from room 2?
I can do it as quickly as possible. Others can join. Like, first point is, I think the presence of community members, community ethical review board will be able to give you a more harm aspect of the community. Will be known to the review board. Second is ethical review board are often averse to taking risks. So the presence of community might actually help them to take certain risks. Then the third one is, it is also about what is emerging in exceedingly is about the paternalism, third voice, deity being invoked, how the perception of ethics itself is like it is very thin line between about protection and when it is about control. And the concept of othering is very clearly about the community that reflects in the ethics process. So these are the important things which is there. But in terms of limitations and challenges, it was about institutions would be reluctant to give up their power or the privilege which is there. And often the academics will come back and say, like retrospectively, that if you had come to us, institutional review board, there was a time, etc., we would have done, we would have been able to help you more, etc. So that kind of a narrative might come, because of which this might not find place. And the third thing is the timing is very important, like how much time we can give for this kind of a community process, etc., etc. Yeah. Others can add.
Anybody want to add? Okay, well, we'll move on to room 3, which I know Alison was in, whether you or someone else would like to give some feedback.
I can. How long do I have?
Just
Sorry.
2 or 3.
Just 2 minutes. Okay, I'll be really quick. It was a larger discussion, but there was discussion around the value of Pradeep's model and thinking about ethical review processes involving communities, but also we had a discussion around what is the community. And how do we establish if we're the people that we're selecting for ethical review processes represent all members and all voices within that community. So there was a discussion around representation via those processes, and the importance of finding out what the community value in terms of ethical processes, and also we have a discussion about the value of some of the existing ethical principles within traditional review processes, and how they might kind of have a role in safeguarding. But we kept coming back to this issue of how to establish that the community is being represented, and that we know what the community value.
Excellent, thank you very much, Alison. Room 4, which Andrew Russell was in, who would like to feedback from there? Is that you, Andrew?
Yeah, I'll feedback, and then colleagues can chip in as well. Again, very rich sort of range of topics covered. We basically came across this tried to deal with the whole issue of research on a group rather than research with a group. And one interesting comparison was made between journalists, who of course undertake no ethical review as far as we're aware whatsoever, and yet can move into a community and undertake all sorts of extractive kind of research, although sometimes their publicity of the issues that they cover can be very powerful and very worthwhile for the community. So that raises the issue, well, the fundamental point about doing research with a community is how is the knowledge generated going to be used, and who will it be useful for? That came up very strongly. We also, an interesting concept was introduced about the tyranny of narrative, because if we're trying to create a piece of research from which we can draw some sort of conclusions, then the messiness of everyday life that a lot of research has to sort of grapple with can be quite a sort of complicating factor. Another interesting point was that we're all assuming that research is terribly exciting and ethics is terribly exciting, but in an institutional review context, it can be very difficult to get academics to engage with ethical review processes, because it can often be quite boring. So how do we deal with that? We had a couple of questions for Pradeep as well. One was how did Pradeep recruit the individuals who came to represent the community, their own communities? We wondered whether they needed compensation for the time that they were using or losing when they might have been engaged in some sort of other activities. And also, how did he deal with the issue that was raised about, in this kind of online world, building trust with people when you're not actually able to engage with them in face-to-face? So that's a few of the many interesting things our group discussed. I don't know if anybody wants to chip.
Anybody else want to add? Thank you, Andrew and Group 4. You always had a very rich discussion. And then room 5, Wang Yi, I know you were in that room.
Yeah, thanks to Ruth. Yeah. So stuff that hasn't already really been covered. We talked a lot about the nature of ethics committees and sort of meaningful participation, issues of power and control, whether participants in the board taken seriously. And we talked a lot about how the actual process of ethical review is sort of mysterious to a lot of people. They don't really know quite what goes on. Sometimes they're seen as one size fits all, sort of not very nuanced. Yeah, just a sort of lack of representation or meaningful representation on ethics committees, whether people are paid for their work. A lot about issues of control and liability. So universities tending to be very risk averse. So sort of more concerned about power sharing. I think that covers what we talked about.
Excellent. Thank you very much. It does sound like you had some very rich discussions in those short breakout groups. Pradeep, I'm wondering whether you would like to respond, particularly to the two questions that Group 4 asked, which was, how did you recruit the people who were part of your community boards, and were they compensated? And secondly, how you dealt with building trust when you were having to work remotely or online. So those two questions, and then maybe any other issues, particularly I think that issue of representation. What is the community? And I know you have some views and you've got examples of where communities are divided and how you handle that.
Yeah, right. So these are the questions, I think that most of the questions are which we struggled with. So one is, the question is, what is community, which Alison asked, which is like a Dalit. If you say there would be, you can have many Dalits who can represent the Dalit identity. Should we bring any person who is in the Dalit identity to be in the community board? Will that make sense? Or we should have a Dalit who is part of the beneficiaries of the program or the respondents of the research, whether we should bring that particular community to be represented in the ethical review board, right? If you in our initial things, we had actually done both the cases in terms of building the identity representative as well as the respondent representative from the same identity to get into the ethical review board. So that's where we did the bonded labor and child labor scenarios. But over the period, we realized that that what is needed is that if they really do not understand about what is research and what is program, how it is implemented, what is the impact of the research, etc., it would be challenging for them to associate what they understand by ethics with the how it is going to influence the research itself, right? So in that sense, what we thought was, at this point of time, in all the three categories, community boards, what we have done is we brought the identity person representative as well as the person from the same in the same program or the research as a respondent. So that those two identities are an important identity with which we brought them on board. Now, how do we select them is the second question in terms of it. In this, because the COVID had already started and the lockdown has started, so therefore, in this instance, we brought many of the people whom we know to some extent. It is not like totally a unknown person from the community who are brought in, because we brought them on the whom we have known. Otherwise, in a normal scenario, we would have brought some totally unknown person for us and have certain ice-breaking sessions with them so that we are able to build the trust. Now, the third question, how do you build the trust? How did we build the trust here? I think what we realized was, I think we had a discussion on this with Andrew and Sarah also at some point of time. I think what we tried to do was, we in the beginning, at least the 2 or 3 sessions in the beginning of the session, what we tried to do was, we did not talk about their identity at all in the beginning. We asked them to talk about other marginalized identities. So in that sense, we tried to build a narrative in narrations in that discussion in such a way that we are not trying to judge them in their location, but we together are actually talking about some other community whom they do not represent, but they are marginalized. So a lot of sessions went on that to first to understand marginalization from the third perspective. And when we are talking about unknown to each of us, both of us, it is easier for us to actually build a trust in the beginning, and then we gradually introduced their identity into it. So that's it. And the last one is about the compensation thing. In this case, we had to give them a data cost and to it, and we also are building them, all these people, as a standing kind of a community review board. So in that sense, we are trying to help them, trying to even evolve a contract with them in terms of sitting charges, etc. We have realized that this time, thankfully, because of the support from from the fellowship grant, we were able to compensate them. Especially, it was very important at the COVID point of time to give them the compensation. So we made that, we had a discussion and we did that. But otherwise, we have realized, at least in 2 studies where we proposed the ethical review board, in fact 3 studies, and in each of the cases, actually the donors were very, very excited about it, and they supported the ethical review community, ethical review process. So I personally feel at this point of time, it is at that stage of, I can call it as creative way of it, that there is less of panic among the donors or among the academic community to introduce one new system like this. So I'm not very sure it's a sustainable part of it, because at some point of time there will be a power contestation or a privilege. Then at that time, we don't know how will we be able to compensate them. If it is to, ideally it is an honorary job with some kind of an honorarium, where their time we should be able to compensate, because it requires a lot of reading, it requires a lot of analysis, it requires a lot of discussions, etc. So therefore, I would locate this as a kind of an honorary, but at the same time a compensatable work. Yeah.
Thank you very much for those very full answers. And as Pradeep has said, it's a work in progress, isn't it? And what's interested Andrew and me about this process, which Pradeep has been reporting on over the months, is the way in which they're all learning together and being flexible, creative, just like we are in participatory research itself. And I think probably many of you didn't get around to discussing so much that last question about, have you got examples from your own countries? I know there are community-based ethical review boards, particularly in North America, and that work in quite different ways. Would it work in your country? And I think, like all participatory research, we have to adapt to our own countries and our own contexts. And so whether people need payment, whether they can get payment, whether donors are keen, whether you can get a community-based ethical review board actually paid for by a university to run alongside its IRB, or is that co-option? Would that eventually reduce freedom? So how these things work and can work are very context specific, aren't they? But I think the example that Pradeep has given us from India is actually very exciting. And to me, it seems quite different from the way in which the review boards that I've heard of in North America are working, which are tending to mimic perhaps the institutional review boards, but with community members. But I think that the idea is very, very important about reversing the power and ensuring that the people whose lives are affected by the research that's going to happen actually have a say in what counts as ethical. And that is very challenging for us, because we don't want to go into some kind of ethical relativism. There may be some stances that have to be held, and one of Pradeep's ethical dilemmas was around praxis. If praxis has a particular stance on anti-stigmatization, on challenging the caste system, then what if the some members of the community don't want to engage. We all have that kind of challenge, but it's very important to be able to debate it, to deliberate it. And these forums, I think, of the community ethical review boards are spaces where that kind of ethical dialogue can take place. And it needs to be slow. Pradeep mentioned time, the time taken to get people involved in this and to think about what is meant by an ethical review board and how can it develop, and the time for deliberation and listening to each other and taking on board the different perspectives from perhaps a divided community, the different ideologies, those who are the liberals, those are the conservatives, those are the transformatory people. So thank you, Pradeep, very, very much indeed. I think it's been a very stimulating and enjoyable session. So with just 1 minute to spare, I think we can probably turn on our microphones and give a round of applause to Pradeep. Okay, and we are hoping to have another session in this series, which Barbara from Amsterdam may be willing to present for us on her work on the ethics of care. So Barbara, you might be able to give us a little wave there. And
hello.
We hope that we can have another Rethinking Ethics session in January. So we've got your names, we'll keep you in touch. And it's now 12:30, so you're free to go. 12:30 my time, you're free to go. Anybody wants to hang around, I think some of us will be here maybe for a few more minutes, or Pradeep will probably stay around for a few more minutes just to answer any further questions. So thank you again, thanks for coming, and hope to see you again next time.